Stay with me.
It hurts.
I've got you. Hold on.
The desert outside of Tucson in the summer of 1873 did not forgive the weak, and it did not spare the hunted. When Elias Cord first saw the woman stumbling across his land at dawn, he almost mistook her for a mirage, a dark shape weaving between the saguaros. Bleeding from her side, her moccasins torn to shreds against the caliche rock. He had been up since before sunrise, mending the fence line on the eastern edge of his 40 acres, when the shape collapsed just beyond the dry wash. Elias was not a man who prayed often, but in that moment, something in his chest tightened like a fist, and he ran. He dropped his tools and ran toward her the way a man runs toward something he cannot explain and cannot leave behind. Her name, he would later learn, was Sunka, a Western Apache woman no older than 25, from a band that had been scattered by a militia raid 3 nights before. The raid had not been sanctioned by any army command. It had been organized by a group of cattlemen from the Gila River Territory who had decided, quietly and without mercy, that the Apache encampment near their grazing land was a problem that needed to be permanently solved. They had ridden in at midnight with torches and rifles. They killed the elders first, then the men. Then they had marked the surviving women for a different kind of death, a slow one, left to the desert with no water, no horse and no direction but away. Sunka had run for 3 days. She had survived on cactus pulp and memory. By the time she fell on Elias Cord's land, she had decided, somewhere between conscious thought and absolute exhaustion, that she was already dead. Elias carried her inside. He was a man built like the land itself, wide-shouldered, deeply tanned, with hands that had known hard work since the age of 9. He had come to Arizona from Tennessee after the war. Between the states took his brother, his father's farm, and whatever belief he had once held that the world was a fair place. He had built his ranch alone. He had buried his horse alone. He had watched 2 neighbors pack up and leave when the Cattlemen's Association started pressuring smaller landowners to fall in line. He was, in most of the ways that mattered in Tucson in 1873, entirely alone, but he knew how to clean a wound. He knew how to boil water and tear a shirt into strips. He knew how to sit beside someone suffering and not look away. Sunka did not trust him, not at first. When she woke on his cot and found a white man sitting across the room, her first instinct was to reach for something to defend herself, and she found nothing. Elias, to his credit, did not move. He simply held up both hands and said in slow, deliberate words, "You're safe here. I'm not going to hurt you." She did not believe him, but she was too weak to leave and he was too stubborn to stop caring. Over the next 3 days, he fed her, changed her bandages, and left the door unlocked at all times. He did not ask her what happened. Sarah waited until she was ready to tell him. That patience, and that rare, almost unfashionable patience, was what finally cracked the wall between them. When she told him what had happened at the encampment, Elias listened without interrupting. She spoke carefully, mixing Apache with broken English, and he leaned forward and listened to every word as though it were testimony before God. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Outside, the desert wind moved through the mesquite in long, sighing waves. Elias sat back in his chair, rubbed his jaw, and looked at the floor for a long moment. Then he looked up and said 6 words that would change both their lives forever. "Tell me the names of the men." Sunka studied his face and looking for cruelty, for ambition, for the particular kind of hunger that she had seen in the eyes of men who saw her, people as obstacles. She found none of those things. What she found instead frightened her more than any of them. She found certainty. The Cattlemen's Association in that part of the Arizona Territory was led by a man named Harlan Pruitt, a broad, florid-faced landowner who controlled 12,000 acres, 2 water rights, and the ear of the territorial magistrate. Pruitt was not the kind of villain who announced himself. He wore clean suits. He shook hands warmly. He donated money to the church in Tucson and made speeches about civilization and progress, and the necessity of order in a wild land. What he meant by order was the continued absence of anyone he considered inconvenient. And for the past 4 years, the Apache bands near the Gila River Territory had been at the top of that list. He had organized the midnight raid himself, using men he paid in cash with no written record. He had fully expected the matter to be finished. He had not expected Elias Cord. Elias rode into Tucson 5 days after finding Sunka, carrying a written account she had helped him compose. Names, dates, descriptions of the men and their horses, the direction they had ridden from, and the specific details that only a witness could know. He went first to the army garrison and was turned away by a lieutenant who told him, with barely concealed boredom, that the Apache were a military matter and civilian complaints were not within his jurisdiction. He went to the magistrate's office and was told to come back in a week. He came back in a week and was told the magistrate was unavailable. He came back again, and again. On his 4th visit, 2 of Pruitt's hired men were waiting for him outside the magistrate's office. They were polite. They told him in language just vague enough to be denied that a man with a small ranch and no family and no allies would be wise to concern himself with his own affairs. Elias looked at both of them for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll be back tomorrow," and rode home. What Pruitt and his men did not know, what no one in Tucson knew, was that Elias Cord had spent 11 months after the war as a courier for a federal reconstruction office in Nashville. He knew how federal jurisdiction worked. He knew the difference between territorial law and federal law. And he knew that what had happened at the Apache encampment was not merely a local grievance, it was a federal crime, a violation of the treaty, agreements that the United States government had signed and then quietly ignored. Elias wrote a letter. He wrote it carefully, over 2 nights by lamplight, while Sunka sat at his table and watched him work. He addressed it to the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington, D.C., and to a federal judge in Santa Fe, whose name he had memorized years ago from a newspaper article about land fraud prosecutions. He included the full account, Sunka's testimony, and his own signed affidavit. He rode to the post office before dawn and sent both letters before anyone in Pruitt's network could know they existed. The weeks that followed were dangerous. Someone shot through his window. One night, his waterline was cut. One of his 2 remaining horses was found dead by the road. Elias did not leave. He borrowed a rifle from a neighboring rancher, one of the few who had not yet been absorbed into Pruitt's sphere of influence, and he kept watch. Sunka, who had recovered enough to move freely, refused to leave as well. She had lived her entire life being driven away from things. She had decided somewhere in the quiet of Elias's small ranch that she was finished with running. She knew the land around the property better than any of Pruitt's hired men, and in the hours before dawn, she moved through it like water, watching and listening. Twice she warned Elias of men approaching before they were close enough to cause harm. Twice her knowledge of the desert saved them both. The federal response, when it came quietly and without announcement. A deputy federal marshal arrived in Tucson on a Tuesday morning in October, accompanied by 2 Army officers from the Department of the Interior. Harlan Pruitt was arrested at his ranch house before noon. 3 of the men who had participated in the raid were arrested within the week. The territorial magistrate, whose complicity had become quietly evident during the federal investigation, resigned his office before charges could be formally filed against him. None of it was dramatic. None of it made the newspapers in the way that violence makes newspapers. But it was real. Elias Cord never sought recognition for any of it. He went back to his 40 acres and his fence line and his difficult, ordinary life. But something had changed, not just in the territory, but in the way he understood himself. He had fought back not with a gun, but with patience, persistence, and the radical act of believing that one woman's life was worth every risk he had taken. Sunka stayed through the winter. In the spring, she returned to what remained of her people, carrying something that had been taken from her 3 nights in a raid and slowly, stubbornly given back to her. The knowledge that there were men in this world who would stand between her and death and not ask for anything in return. Before you go, and if this story moved you, if it reminded you that history is full of quiet courage that never makes the history books, then subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that bell, because every week we bring you stories exactly like this one, forgotten, true and powerful. Stories about real people who chose to do the hard thing when it would have been so much easier to look away. You don't want to miss what's coming next. Join the family.